Hello, everybody. Happy Monday or Tuesday, depending on which day you have American history. I hope you had a wonderful weekend. Don't forget to get your note taker out and record your key notes and answer the big question as we go through our slideshow presentation today. Remember, our big question today is what factors led to Andrew Jackson's election and what were the impacts? Okay, so we're going to make sure we pay close attention to answering that big question. All right, so we're going to start off by talking about the War of 1812. And so in order to really understand the War of 1812, we need to know the causes. So British interference with American trade, impressment of American sailors, British help Native American revolts and support leaders like Tecumseh. So as settlers pushed into Northwest Territory, conflict with the Native Americans rose. England supported Native American efforts to stop settlements, in part to keep the US away from their colonies. So at this point, Great Britain really is trying to hold on to their colonies and shrink down the United States. England and France were also seizing US ships. The US offered to open trade up with whichever country stopped the attacks. Okay, so France stopped, England did not. This created a very anti-English feeling in the United States. And this basically led to the US declaring war against England, okay? So what were the important events of the War of 1812? Well, Francis Scott Key wrote the Star-Spangled Banner during the Battle of Baltimore in 1814. British captured and burned Washington, D.C. So the two sides fought for several years. At the end of the war, the British marched onto D.C. and set the White House on fire. General Andrew Jackson became a hero, defeating the British at New Orleans. And in addition to this, African-American soldiers contributed heavily to the war. So what happened during the Battle of New Orleans? This is a huge battle. So General Andrew Jackson became a national hero by beating British, even though he was outnumbered. The battle happened after the war had eventually ended. So a truce was reached and not much changed. A new United States culture and identity emerged at this point, okay? Remember, there's definitely an anti-British sentiment. So what were the effects of the War of 1812? Americans became more independent and a new national identity emerged. More factories, less dependent on Europe for its economy. All right, so now we're going to talk about James Monroe, who was, maybe you've heard of the Monroe Doctrine, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. So who was James Monroe? He was American president who wrote the Monroe Doctrine, which changed American foreign policy by making it more aggressive and strong. So remember, up to this point, America, for the most part, had remained neutral in foreign affairs. Well, this starts to change with James Monroe. All right, so we come into a time called the era of good feeling. So this is like really kind of a peaceful feeling. People are feeling good about America. America's feeling strong. There's this pride, there's political peace going on. There was the Jeffersonian Republicans and the Federalists and the new ideologies were actually getting along. So there was kind of this warm, happy feeling in America. So it really leads way for Monroe to start to exercise the US's power in foreign affairs. So what was the Monroe Doctrine? It warned European nations that they cannot set up colonies or interfere in Latin American problems anymore. The United States will protect North and South America from Europe. James Monroe changed America's foreign policy from staying neutral to being involved in even peaceful. So basically what happened is a Supreme Court decision strengthened the government. President James Monroe took steps to add territories to the United States. Okay, so General Jackson was sent to recapture slaves that had escaped to Florida when Spain refused to help. Jackson invaded. Okay, so Eventually, this led to some warfare, and Spain agreed to sell Florida to the US. All right, so let's talk about Andrew. Really quick, I wanted to add about the Monroe Doctrine. So Latin American nations had won their own independence from Spain. And so this left European nations fearing the spread of revolution, and they formed an alliance to help countries like Spain. However, the Monroe Doctrine was issued to show that the US would combat any attempt by Europeans to reclaim old colonies lost by revolution. So if you think back in America's history, we originally were all British colonies, right? And so basically what the Monroe Doctrine was saying is, if you come and try to take back your old colonies, we will fight you. Okay, so they created a very strong presence. So this leads to the election of 1824. Okay, this is a pretty big election. So there is a split in the Democratic Republican Party over several issues that led to new parties. So Andrew Jackson was popular and ran for president in 1824. So Andrew Jackson won the popular vote. Those are the ones, remember, cast by the people, but there was no clear winner in the Electoral College. Jackson was a common man. He had been born poor and was orphaned at age 14. The public loved him as one of their own. They were excited that finally, instead of it being an elitist, an aristocrat, someone who wasn't of the people, was finally running and possibly going to be the president. Okay, so because there was a tie of the Electoral College votes, the election had to be decided in the House of Representatives, who voted and picked John Quincy Adams, who is the son of President John Adams, as the winner. So Jackson felt that the election had been stolen away from him, and the people of the United States had been ignored and cheated out of the president they wanted. Sound familiar? Can you connect this to something that's happening today in our politics or very recently? Over the next 4 years, the split between Jackson and the common people of the US and the more privileged people like John Adams led to the complete split of the Democratic Republican Party into two parties. We have the Democrats, which is Jackson, and the Whigs, which is Adams. So this was greatly due to the expansion of the suffrage contribution to his win. So let's see. Election of 1828 equals the development of modern American politics. So it was the first election where all white males could vote because of the ending of property and taxation requirements for voting in many states. It began the modern Democratic Party. During the campaign, Jackson promoted his version of democracy, in which the majority would rule and the power would be taken away from the rich elite and given totally to the people. This became known as Jacksonian democracy. And in fact, you will see today a lot of, there are many candidates who actually will try to run on this same premise, that they are for the people and not the elite or the political elite. So what's the difference between Jeffersonian democracy and Jacksonian democracy? Well, in Jeffersonian, government for the people, but run by well-educated and rich leaders. Okay, this is republicanism. The Jacksonian democracy, okay, it's government for the people and run by the people. So this is our current form of democracy, right? Okay, in Jeffersonian, democracy and political life. Under Jacksonian, democracy encompasses most areas of life: economic, social, and political life. Okay, in Jeffersonian democracy, wanted farmers and mainly agricultural life, which is ironic because it's being ran by the educated elite, which doesn't match that at all. Jacksonian democracy wanted a split between farming and manufacturing, which, as we know, is what ends up happening. Okay, Jeffersonian wanted very limited government, and Jacksonian limited government, but with a very strong president. All right, so let's talk about the spoils system briefly. To the victor belongs the spoils. The winner to the victor belongs all the possessions and power, the spoils, from the loser. So It is a common practice for presidents to be able to appoint cabinet members. But this was the first time a president cleaned house and replaced all appointed position with his supporters. So now this is much more common. Many presidents, when they come in, you're seeing it right now with Biden, if you're paying attention, he is basically getting rid of all of Trump's cabinet members. So this is something that still happens today. Okay, so some people felt as if this was too much power for a president to have and that the system was corrupt. But Jackson defended it, saying it broke the last group's power over Washington policies. All right, so before we jump into the Indian Removal Act, let's talk really quick about sectionalism and the nullification process. So during Jackson's presidency, South Carolina became angered by a high tariff favored by the North. They responded with the Nullification Act, and Jackson knew that this could lead to civil war. A compromise was reached, but the nullification crisis showed that disagreements over state power were not going away. All right, so now we're going to talk briefly about the Indian Removal Act. All right, so the Indian Removal Act, if you have learned anything about it, it is horrific. It is a horrific stain in America's past, like so many others. So what was it? It gave Andrew Jackson the power to negotiate resettlement treaties with the Native Americans and allowed the states to make laws governing their territories. So what does that mean? White settlers hoped to make their fortunes growing cotton in the South. They wanted land and they would do anything to get it. So state governments joined in the effort to drive Native Americans out. Okay, so Jackson thought this act was a fabulous compromise. He believed it would allow the natives to keep their way of life and also allow Americans to get the land they wanted. Instead, the act caused the death and hardship and made natives very upset because they were forced off their land. We know that we are still seeing the ramifications or negative effects of this today in America. So though the Supreme Court had protected Native Americans up to this point, Andrew Jackson had long been an advocate of what he called Indian Removal Act. Okay, he had spent years leading campaigns that resulted in the transfer of hundreds of thousands of acres of land from Native Americans to white farmers. As president, he continued this crusade. Okay, so some groups signed treaties, but thousands of Native Americans were forcefully removed under the Indian Removal Act. Jackson's policies toward Native Americans were devastating and cruel. So this is where we get the Trail of Tears, and literally reading about it makes me want to cry. So I hope you understand how impactful this was on the Native Americans in America. The forced removal of the Cherokee Indians from native lands to Indian Territory, parts of Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nebraska, because he wanted their land for farming and gold. So although some of the Native Americans did sign treaties with the US government, many did not and were forcefully removed from their land. So it was called the Trail of Tears because natives were forced by the military to walk hundreds of miles to resettle lands they didn't have any knowledge of. The Cherokee were forced to leave their homes with little more than the clothes on their backs. The march lasted for months and took place during the winter. A quarter of the natives died on the trail because of starvation, the cold, and disease. Not all tribes went without a fight. Some natives fought to the death to protect their lands, and some even staged huge rebellions, killing many soldiers before being beaten by the government and forced to move anyways. So on the march known as the Trail of Tears, many Cherokee died. It's horrendous to even think about this. US troops marched them more than 1,200 miles to the new Indian Territory. Whooping cough, typhus, dysentery, cholera, and starvation were epidemics along the way. And historians estimate that more than 5,000 Cherokees died as a result of the journey. So sectional differences increased. So the North wanted tariffs. So we see this dividing of the country growing, okay? They wanted land prices in the West to stay high because low prices would attract workers away from the cities, would endanger the manufacturing base in the North, okay? So the South opposed tariffs because most of their cotton was sold to international buyers. Tariffs had been increasing steadily for 10 or 12 years, and the South felt like the whole nation was being run according to what was beneficial to just one part of the nation instead of to the nation as a whole. So the tariff of abominations and the nullification crisis, I said a little bit about this. Tariff of abomination was a high tariff that set off a huge debate in Congress. South Carolina threatened to secede because they are being forced to pay it. So secede means to break apart from, okay? So they wanted to possibly leave the United States of America and become their own country. They insisted that if a state felt a federal law was in direct conflict with the state's best interest, the state could refuse to follow the law. The state had the right to nullify a law they found unjust. This further split the interests of the North and the South and increased sectionalism. Andrew Jackson did not agree with the idea that a law could be nullified and publicly asserted the authority of the federal government in the nullification crisis. So to keep South Carolina from actually trying to secede from the Union, the federal government backed down and lowered the tariff, but neither side was done with the debate. South Carolina still believed that the tariff was too high. It took compromise to prevent bloodshed and rebellion. Again, threatening to secede at this point was a really big deal, especially because they had fought so hard in America to finally unite the states, right? In the end, the debate only served to further split the nation into North and South. So we also see the end of the national bank. If you think back to the beginning, the original fight, right, between Jefferson and Hamilton was this idea of a national bank. So this is a really big debate from the beginning for the national bank. So in Jackson's opinion, the National Bank of the US was far too powerful. During his second term, Jackson began having all federal money deposited into state banks rather than the federal one. So basically undermining the system of the national bank. Jackson won the war on the National Bank of the United States, but future problems with the economy would be the result. That is the end of our presentation today. I hope you learned something. Make sure that you finish your notes. Have a great rest of the day.